there isn't anything that can stand up against the truth. And I believe that, I think, to some degree, because it just seems self-evident. It's like, if the truth is deeply reflective of the structure of reality, the claim that the lie can dominate is the claim that the unreal can defeat the real. And that's, you are literally insane if you believe that.
He's a clinical psychologist and a professor and a best-selling author, but I think the greatest thing about him is his commitment to unwavering truth. He just will not bullshit about things. He tells the truth, and he digs in, and he's willing to look for the truth. He doesn't believe he just has it, but he also studies. What I really wanted him to chat with us about today is, in the middle of all this chaos, seemingly chaos, there is a larger order, and the large order can be found by studying the stories of humanity. You know, the hero's journey is one of those stories. And perhaps, you know, he studies all the great religious texts, but he's been doing a whole series, some of you may have seen on the Bible, different portions of the Bible. Please help us welcome our friend, amazing soul, Dr. Jordan Peterson, everybody. Give it up for him. Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's good to see you. Good to see all of you there. Thank you for that introduction.
Our pleasure. You have the floor, my dear friend.
Well, I think we'll take off from that intro. The first thing I should let everybody know, this is a conclusion that people have come to across a variety of different disciplines. Literary criticism, computer intelligence, robotics, study of perception from the physiological perspective, a real coming together of observations across multiple disciplines. And so here's the fundamental realization. We have to see the world through a story. In fact, if you describe to someone the structure through which you see the world, what you're actually doing is telling them a story. So here's the way to think about it. When you go see a movie, it grips you emotionally. And the reason that happens is because the filmmaker, the writers, provide you with some insight into the goals of the characters. And when you can adopt someone else's goals, you can align your emotions with their emotions. And that means that you can feel what they feel, and that means that you can understand them. And so, if you adopt the story that someone else is telling, then you can literally mimic them. You can mimic their nervous system with yours. And you have that feeling of being in sync with someone or in tune with someone. And you have that feeling because that's exactly what's happening. So, not only do we have to see the world through a story, but the story that we see the world through determines how we respond to things emotionally. So this is a useful thing to know. You know, if the world is unfolding for you in a manner that you don't find particularly acceptable, if you're anxious and upset and depressed and hurt and hopeless, one possibility is that you're not looking at the world through a particularly productive story. Now, once you understand that you have to look at the world through a story, or that it's inevitable that you will, another question immediately arises, which is, well, what story do you or should you see the world through? And that's the subject of great debate. In fact, the whole cultural war that we're in at the moment, that's turning everything into a kind of chaos, is actually a debate between the promoters of different stories. Now, the postmodern and neo-Marxist types, they tend to insist either that all our stories are fragmented and subjective and hedonistic at their base. There's no such thing as an overarching, uniting narrative. That was the claim of the French postmodernists. Or there's an alternative claim, which is that the only story that really unites people, the only story that really exists, is one of power, and that you can see the whole world as a reflection of the competition between different stories of power. So when you hear the Marxist types, for example, make the claim that our culture is nothing but an oppressive patriarchy, and that marriage is an oppressive institution, and that all economic relationships are merely those of exploitation. You're hearing an insistence that the only story that people can live out is the story of domination and oppression and victimization and mutual exploitation. It's an unbelievably dismal view of humanity. It also justifies the use of power on behalf of the people who put forward the story, because if there's no motivating ethos other than domination, then it's perfectly reasonable for you to use nothing but domination in your attempts to deal with other people. Now, that's a very pathological story. I would also say, by the way, it's a very counterproductive story. You know, you might say that people who wield power can become remarkably successful. You could point to dictators, for example, like the man who runs North Korea, and say, well, Dr. Peterson, you claim that power isn't a very productive story and that it doesn't work very well in the long run, but if you look at brutal societies like North Korea, you see that people who are perfectly willing to use power rise to the highest positions. How can you describe that as anything other than success? And I would say, just because you're the biggest devil in hell doesn't mean that you've won the game. In fact, quite the contrary. And you can attain a position of dominance through force, but if you don't think you'll pay a price for that, you're a bloody fool. Alexander Solzhenitsyn did quite a nice job of investigating the psychological state of Joseph Stalin, for example. And Stalin was clearly the most powerful man in the world's most corrupt country, which made him the biggest devil in that particular form of hell. And you might say, well, what did he gain for his trouble? And I can tell you what he gained. It was that every single person around him lied about absolutely everything all the time. He had no true friends. He just had sycophants who wanted to be near a bully. He distrusted everyone. He had contempt for everyone, of course, because he was so terrifying that people conducted themselves atrociously around him. He engaged in a variety of quasi-genocidal enterprises. He was a murderous thug, and he ended up likely murdered. And, you know, it isn't obvious to me at all that any of that constitutes success. And so that's the typical outcome of strategies that are based on power. It's not advisable. Now, you can think about this in your own life, you know. Maybe you've used instrumental and manipulative means to get to where you want to go, and maybe you think that's necessary. But I would say you don't want to have a marriage where the fundamental relationship is one of power, where one of you is a tyrant and the other is a slave, and maybe you alternate roles, but there's no reciprocity or mutuality there. There's no genuine love and regard. There's just force. And you certainly don't want friendships that are predicated on that presumption. You want to be around people who want to be around you, not people that you forced or otherwise enticed or manipulated into being around you. And then on the business front, many of you are very successful, and those of you who are properly successful know perfectly well that the way that you establish a business that has a good probability of surviving into the medium and long term is to make contracts with the people that you work with that are to your mutual benefit, right? So your interests are aligned, so that you're thrilled to be working together, and then to offer your customers genuine service and value for the money. And none of that's about exploitation, and none of that's about power. It's a completely different ethos. And so you might ask yourself, well, if you're going to characterize the ethos that isn't power, that unites people, that stabilizes them psychologically and provides for social unity, how would you characterize that? And Tony made some reference to this, and there are archetypal themes that echo throughout human history that detail out the fundamental story of life. And one of the most fundamental of those, there's probably two. There's an adventure story and a romance story, but I'll start with the adventure story. And the adventure story is essentially the myth of the hero. And the myth of the hero, which is, by the way, is the story that our culture, Western culture, is predicated on, and I would say all functional stories, posits that human beings are not automatons or clockwork machines that are driven by deterministic functions, but creatures that constantly confront what you might describe as a transforming horizon of possibility. So imagine, when you get up in the morning, what confronts you, your consciousness is not so much the furniture in your room and the things that you can see that are right in front of you, but the possibilities of the day. The possibilities of the day open up as that vast domain of potential occurrences that you can play some role in determining. You're going to be thinking about the problems that you have that need to be solved, and you're going to be thinking about the opportunities that beckon to you that you could, in principle, take advantage of and utilize, if you have any sense, to your medium and long-term advantage and simultaneously to the advantage of the other people around you. And so you're contending with a realm of possibility, and you shape that with your vision. And the way that that's portrayed in mythologies of the hero is generally with some motif that's analogous to that of a dragon fight. And so you can think about St. George in that regard, and the ancient story is something like this. It's the story of The Hobbit, by the way. It's the story of The Lord of the Rings. It's the story of Harry Potter. It's the story of the movie Jaws. It's deeply embedded in the biblical corpus. It's Star Wars. It's everywhere. This story is that there's a city, and it's threatened by the emergence of ancient chaotic forces that were once under control. And a hero emerges who notes the onset of this threat and who decides to step outside the bounds of the city and confront this creature, dragon often. And a dragon, by the way, a dragon is a symbolic representation of a predator. You know, people say there's no such thing as a dragon, but it's an imaginary creature. It's like, that's actually not true. What a dragon is an amalgam of the features of the creatures that have classically preyed upon human beings. So it's a predatory bird and a predatory cat and a predatory reptile and the destructive force of fire all combined. And so dragon and predator, dragon is the image of predator. And the ancient human idea is that our consciousness, our heroic consciousness, is that which moves out into the world to confront the eternal predator and to overcome it. Now, we obviously do that because we can protect ourselves and our children from predatory beasts. We can also protect ourselves from predatory people, and we can protect ourselves from the predator that lurks in our own heart. That's more of a spiritual twist on the classic St. George and the dragon story, let's say, which is in variant forms the oldest story that we know. What's the idea? Well, the eternal dragon of chaos always threatens the habitable city. And people who are awake and alert and who are acting in accordance with the highest ethical principles become aware that such a threat exists and then decide to confront it voluntarily. And that's the image of the knight, let's say, armored knight, confronting the dragon in its lair. Now, interestingly enough, it's classically the case that predatory beasts, dragons, let's say, hoard treasure. They also hoard virgins, strangely enough. And the reason they hoard treasures is quite straightforward. It's because that which you most need to find is always lurking where you least want to look. That's a good leitmotif for life. So you could imagine that there are things in your life that you're avoiding that you know you should do, that you don't want to confront, that frighten you, that activate your predator detection systems, let's say. And if you can learn to organize yourself so that you have enough courage to take on that chaotic unknown, then you'll discover things about yourself and the world that you don't know and master them. And the consequence of that will be that you'll be rewarded. And that's, of course, the treasure that the dragon eternally guards. And the rule of thumb is fundamentally, well, the larger the dragon, the more likely you're going to get eaten. But by the same token, the larger the treasure. The virginal motif in that story is, the motif of the virgin, is that women are, what would you say, deeply inclined to be attracted to male figures who are capable of taking on chaos and prevailing. So if you're the sort of person who can confront the unknown in a visionary manner, and you can shape it into the cosmos that's habitable and good, then that also makes you maximally attractive as a partner. And that, as I said, that's the oldest story we know. In fact, the oldest written story we know is a Mesopotamian story called the Enuma Elish, where the main hero, Marduk, is in fact a St. George-like figure who confronts a dragon who threatens the entire world with destruction. And that's essentially the motif of most adventure stories. Sometimes the hero confronts a giant instead of a dragon, and the giant is usually a symbol of something like the corrupt state. So, there's two variants of heroes, and one variant of hero confronts chaos as such, just disorder and uncertainty, and the other variant of hero confronts corrupt gigantism. That's a good way of thinking about it, and that's another eternal enemy of human progress on the psychological and social front, right? The tendency of organizations to develop into tyrannical giants that have to be slain in order for proper order to be established. And so that story of confrontation with chaos is extraordinarily deeply rooted in Western culture. You see it expressed in its most fundamental form, arguably, in Christianity, because the crucifix itself is a symbol of something like chaos. So imagine, if you're thinking about this psychologically, one of the things you might ask yourself is, why have we collectively been gazing, for example, at this terrible figure of the crucifix for 2,000 years? And to get a sense of how shocking that is, imagine that the object of worship was a man hanging with a broken neck from a noose. It's exactly the same kind of image. It's an image of state-sponsored torture, fundamentally. It's an image of, what would you say? It's an image of the sum total of all vulnerable possibilities. And so in the Christian story, the eternal Redeemer, who's in principle the model for behavior, is the person who voluntarily takes on the entire chaotic weight of existence. And so in Christ's passion, all the terrible things that can happen to any particular person are amalgamated together and form part of his catastrophic adventure. And so you could imagine in your own life, and this has already happened to many of you in many ways, well, what terrible things might happen to you? Well, you can be hurt physically, badly. You can be tortured, let's say. You can be put to death. You could be tortured physically and be put to death young. That could happen as a consequence of being betrayed. It could happen as a consequence of being betrayed by someone extremely close to you, let's say your best friend or your marital partner. It could happen because the state turns against you. It could happen because the state turns against you even at the hands of your own people. And that could happen to you even if you were innocent. And so you can see that in some ways that's the sum total of all possible fears. And the crucifix is an image of the sum total of all possible fears. And the reason that it's a redemptive symbol, at least in part, is because, and this is why there's a Christian injunction, let's say, to pick up your cross and stumble uphill with it, let's say, to pick up your cross and bear it. The idea is that you're going to be best prepared to take on the true difficulties of your life by confronting the potential existence of all of those problems before they make themselves known. Because I could say, if you all wanted to be more resilient in your life, and that would mean less stress, that would mean less anxious, mean less subject to pain and depression and nihilistic thoughts, and more able to spring back when trouble visited you, one of the ways that you could make yourself more resilient would be to envision, for example, how you would react to, well, perhaps bad medical news on your behalf or on the behalf of someone you love, or betrayal by someone close to you, including yourself, or being potentially mobbed and alienated by your social group or your ethnic group or your political group, or being subject to the tyranny of the state, or your own weakness. To walk through that and to face that as a, what would you say, as a inevitable likely reality and to fortify your character in, what would you say, in preparation for that eventuality. And you could ask yourself, as sensible people, well, how the hell could it possibly be any different? You know perfectly well that you're not going to be prepared to confront anything that you avoid. Obviously, how can you prepare yourself to confront something that you're going to avoid? And given that you know that your life is going to be rife with a set of irreducible difficulties, how could you possibly be any better prepared than to face that beforehand and to understand that that's part of your destiny? And then even more, to take that on as voluntarily, as something that you're not only willing to do, but maybe capable of learning to do, well, with, I suppose, in a spirit of radical acceptance, and maybe even now and then something approximating joy. You know, it's a lot to ask for, right? That you have to maintain your moral compass and your hopeful optimism in the face of the worst that can happen to you. But what the hell's your alternative? You know, if the chickens do come home to roost and things start to go badly for you, and you are terrified by that and embittered as a consequence, and then you turn away from what's positive and highest, all that's going to happen clearly is that your suffering is going to get a lot worse, and that you're going to distribute that suffering to the people around you. So, like, how in the world is that going to work? And so the radical types, especially the intellectuals, they insist that, well, we can orient ourselves quite well with a kind of subjective hedonism. That's the hedonism of the moment and of subjective self-promotion, let's say. And more Marxist types insist that we maneuver through the world merely as a consequence of our imposition of various schemes designed to accrue to us all the power. But there's no evidence that a hedonistic orientation towards life works, which is why most of us mature beyond the state we're at when we're 2 years old. And there's no evidence at all that an orientation towards power and domination actually constitutes a good strategy psychologically or socially. So all that's complete bloody rubbish as far as I can tell. And I think there's endless evidence now gathered on all sorts of fronts to indicate that that's the case. And then you might say, well, as I mentioned before, what's the alternative? And the alternative is something like full frontal confrontation with the most dreadful elements of existence. So in the Christian story, I could take it one step further, because this is also very interesting to note. So to imitate Christ in the Christian sense is to take on the full catastrophe of vulnerable existence, right? To face the reality of death, to face the reality of torture and betrayal at the hands of friends, enemies, and the state. To understand that that's part and parcel of destiny. But, you know, it doesn't end there, and that's quite interesting, too. I don't think that you've lived a very deep life or a very long life if you haven't come to understand at some point in your life that there are worse things than death, and maybe worse things than pain. You can see this make itself manifest in people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder. People who have PTSD are generally not merely people who've been hurt by life. They're people who've been touched by malevolence. You know, and it's one thing to suffer, but it's another thing to suffer pointlessly at the hands of people who are doing nothing but trying to produce suffering. And that's not a bad definition of evil. And so, and anyone with any sense who has paid any attention at all, for example, to the history of the 20th century, knows perfectly well that a sensible person clearly admits to the existence of evil. I mean, how else would you characterize what happened in Nazi Germany, or in the Stalinist Soviet Union, or in Maoist China, or now in North Korea? I mean, if you don't think that's evil, then you don't attribute the same meaning to the word that I attribute to it, let's say. It's a stark reality. And so you might add that to one of the stark realities that you have to confront along with the contemplation of your own morality, is that you have to contend with the existence of malevolence. And the way that's laid out in the Christian story, which is a variant of the hero myth, by the way, the deepest variant of it, arguably, that you have to confront malevolence itself as well as mortal vulnerability in order to maximize your resilience and, weirdly enough, to foster the deepest levels of hope. You see that in the Christian story with the insistence that when Christ was crucified, he not only died in some real sense and had to go through all of that, but also had to descend to the depths of hell itself and to encounter the deepest abyss of human malevolence. And I would say that's also morally incumbent on us. I mean, this is a terrible thing to tell people, right? Because it really means that in order to become everything you could be, you have to face the worst that there is to face. But then again, like I said, if you think about that like a sensible person for 15 seconds, you understand very quickly that you're not going to develop your character by shrinking away from things. And you certainly aren't going to do that with your kids. You don't tell your kids, listen, son, the best thing to do in life is to shrink away from everything that's difficult. Not if you're someone who actually loves your son and wants to encourage him. You say instead, look, kiddo, there's something within you that can respond to any challenge, no matter how deep. And then maybe you encourage him to take on the most abysmal challenges in the hopes that he could succeed and become who he could be. And that's the appropriate fundamental orienting story that all healthy people and all thriving states has to act out and interpret the world through. And that's very useful to know, right? Voluntary confrontation with chaos and malevolence. That's the pathway to, that's the pathway to the eternal resurrection. That's the fundamental hero story. And that's the ultimate treasure. That's another way of thinking about it, right? That's how you gain your life by losing it. And there's nothing in that, as far as I can tell, that isn't just true, psychologically and psychophysiologically and scientifically and theologically. And so, that's probably a good place to end that.